It was stained with soy sauce and somebody's thumbprint. That's how I found the quilt I spent 6 months sewing, folded into the corner of a cardboard box in my granddaughter's apartment, wedged between bubble wrap and newspaper, as if it were nothing more than packing material. I stood there, staring at it, pretending I didn't notice, pretending I hadn't recognized the edge of Derek's blue flannel shirt, the one I'd stitched into the lower border, or the corner embroidered with the date Claire was born, in thread the colour of storm water. I told myself maybe it was temporary, maybe she'd just moved in and hadn't unpacked yet, maybe the quilt was just resting there for a moment. But then she leaned over the open box with a laugh and said, "Oh, that old thing? It was perfect for wrapping dishes. Kept the plates from knocking around." She said it so easily, as if it had been a rag, not a record of our lives. As if it hadn't taken me 6 months, arthritic fingers and all, to piece it together, stitch by careful stitch, in dim light, with aching eyes, and a crooked spine that still remembers the hours I bent over the frame. I didn't say anything. Not then. I just smiled the way women smile when something inside them falls, and they don't want the room to feel it. I nodded and turned away, heart clenched so tightly I could feel my pulse in my gums. I'm 81 years old. I live in a small apartment on the second floor of a senior complex that smells like cafeteria vegetables and furniture polish. There's a pine tree outside my window that loses all its needles in November, and I watch the squirrels make a game of dodging the groundskeeper who always forgets to close the gate. I have a kettle, a recliner that groans when I sit, and a photo of my husband, Derek, on the nightstand. It's not much, but it's mine. I don't drive anymore. I don't travel. I get my groceries delivered once a week, and sometimes I watch the neighbor boy practice skateboard tricks in the parking lot. He never lands them, but I admire his persistence. I used to think that was enough. I used to believe I'd made peace with this small, quiet life. But that moment in Claire's apartment, standing in a room that smelled like candle wax and cheap takeout, watching the quilt I poured my memories into used as a cushion for someone else's plates, something cracked in me. Not loudly, not like a breaking window or a dish shattering on the floor. No, it was quieter than that, like the sound of a book closing in an empty room, final but soft. I left her apartment without saying what I really thought, because that's what you do when you're a grandmother. You absorb the insult, smooth the moment, and tell yourself it isn't worth a scene. You tell yourself she's young, she's busy, she didn't mean it that way. But it doesn't matter how she meant it. What matters is how it felt. And it felt like erasure, like being reduced to a useful fabric, once comforting, now disposable. And what scared me wasn't just the dismissal, it was how familiar it had become. You see, that quilt wasn't just cloth. It was my history, sewn from the scraps of who I used to be, the hem of my daughter's Easter dress from 1974, the gingham from the kitchen curtains in our first home, the patch I cut from the apron I wore every Sunday when Derek made his famous roast chicken. It held pieces of birthday parties, snow days, long summers, where the air smelled of cut grass and everything felt endlessly possible. Each square was a story, each thread a reminder that my life, though no longer loud or necessary, had once been full of people, of laughter, of purpose. Claire didn't know that when she unwrapped the dishes. Or maybe she did and didn't care. I don't know which would hurt more. She didn't even thank me properly when I gave it to her. At the wedding, she barely looked at the box. Her eyes were on the camera, on the guests, on the filter she planned to use for the photos. I waited for a moment. Just a flicker of recognition. A squeeze of my hand. A glance that said, "I see what you did." But it never came. She hugged me with one arm, already turning away to greet someone else, I remember thinking, maybe she'll open it later. Maybe she'll call. She didn't. Weeks passed, and I imagined her finding it late at night, maybe during a quiet moment, maybe during a fight with her new husband when she needed comfort. I pictured her wrapping it around her shoulders, breathing in the lavender I'd pressed into the folds. I let myself believe she'd feel held, not just warm, that she'd understand. It wasn't just a gift. It was a legacy, a stitched confession of everything I'd never been able to say out loud, that I missed her, that I missed being needed, that I was still here, still loving her, in the only way I knew how. But no, she used it for dishes. And when I asked her, gently, if she'd found it helpful, she laughed and said, "It was great. Took the brunt of the soy sauce spill. Could have ruined the plates otherwise." Like it had been a napkin, like it had done its job by being sacrificed. There's a cruelty in unthinking casualness. That's what people don't understand. It's not the shouting or the rejection that slices deepest. It's the offhand remarks, the unmeant indifference. The way they don't look back when they walk out of the room. The way they leave your effort folded in silence. I didn't cry when I got home. I sat in my chair, turned on the kettle, and let the steam fog up the window until the parking lot disappeared. I looked at my hands, the crooked fingers that had once known how to soothe a fever, how to braid hair in perfect lines, how to hem a prom dress in the dark because my daughter forgot to mention the school dance until the night before. These hands built a family, and now they are tolerated at holidays, mentioned in passing, called cute when they shake. They only call when someone needs a recipe, a reminder, or a check. I used to send birthday cards with $20 bills tucked inside. Now I'm not even sure they open them. I get the same thank you text every year. Copy-paste, same emoji. Sometimes they don't even bother to change the punctuation. So, yes, it was just a quilt. And also, it wasn't. It was a message in fabric, and it was ignored, then stained, then shoved in a box next to crumpled newspaper. And me, I was told, with a smile and a giggle, that I should be glad it came in handy, that it served a purpose. That's the word that caught in my throat. Purpose. As if that's all I have left. To serve a purpose. To wrap their mess, soften their burdens, keep things from breaking. No one asks what I want anymore. No one asks what I remember. They assume I've forgotten because I don't bring things up. But silence isn't absence. It's strategy. I stopped offering stories because no one listens. I stopped volunteering help because it's expected, not appreciated. I stopped reminding them I exist between Christmases. And now, maybe, I need to stop something else. Something deeper. Maybe I need to stop trying to pass down pieces of a past they never wanted to inherit. Maybe it's time to keep what's left of me for myself. Not out of spite, but out of self-preservation. Because what I gave them was love, and what they returned it with was usefulness. I don't want to be useful anymore. I want to be seen. And I think it starts with stopping the stitching, at least for them. I didn't intend to see it. I didn't go looking for proof. That's the thing about betrayal. It doesn't announce itself. It sits quietly in the corner of an ordinary afternoon and waits. It waits until you are unguarded, until your hands are full and your voice is soft, until your guard has long since been lowered in the name of family. That day, I had stopped by Claire's apartment because she had asked if I could bring over an extra bundt pan. She was hosting a Friendsgiving for her college friends. Something new. Something hers. I had smiled and said of course, because that's what I always said, even when I was tired, even when my knees ached and the bus ride jostled my back like a loose drawer. I carried that pan across 3 transfers and 4 blocks. I carried it like an offering. When she opened the door, her face was flushed with effort and heat. She had been cooking, I thought, or maybe just panicking. The apartment smelled of cinnamon, wine, and something artificial, like vanilla candles pretending to be cookies. It was small, not messy, but busy. Boxes half opened, dishes on the counter, a playlist chattering from a Bluetooth speaker. She kissed my cheek, barely touching, and took the pan with a distracted thanks. I asked if I could sit for a minute. She said sure, but maybe don't sit on the couch. She hadn't vacuumed yet. I found a place at the dining table, next to a stack of folded napkins shaped like autumn leaves. She returned to the kitchen, half listening, talking about the recipe she was trying from a food blogger, how hard it was to find vintage charm plates, how her friends were used to a certain standard. I sipped from a glass of water and nodded, pretending I understood. I didn't. But I wanted to. I wanted to stay near her world, even if the air had changed. And then, as she pulled open a lower cabinet to find a tray, something tumbled. A shallow box, opened by accident, its flaps loose. A pile of plates teetered near the edge, and I stood instinctively, worried something might break. That's when I saw it. A familiar pattern, folded and faded, poking out from the bottom. Not just fabric, but that fabric, the quilt. The one I had wrapped in soft tissue and tied with a ribbon the colour of spring. The one I had pressed and folded and prayed over. The one I had stitched with hands that cramped at night and eyes that blurred from strain. The quilt I gave her on her wedding day. The quilt I had nearly bled for. The quilt I had wanted to be my wordless gift of history and hope. It was in the bottom of a dish box, partly covered with a saucepan and a set of mismatched glasses. She saw my face before I could hide it. "Oh, that?" she said, casually, almost with amusement. It was perfect for the dishes. You know, like how people use blankets when they move. It kept the china safe. The china. She had used the quilt to protect the china. Not just any blanket, not the old moving pads from the hardware store, but the quilt I had made with the last of my strength. My tongue felt thick in my mouth. I wanted to ask if she had even read the note I had attached to it, the one where I had written, "Every stitch is a memory, every square, a story." I wanted to ask if she remembered that Derek's funeral tie was stitched into the edge, if she noticed the lace from my wedding gloves near the centre. But I said none of it. I just smiled. That grandmother's smile, tight-lipped, thin, grateful for crumbs. She kept talking, something about how fragile the edges of the china were, how they needed something soft. Something soft. And that's what I had become. I left soon after, told her I had another errand. She barely noticed. She hugged me with one arm again and said, "Thanks for the pan, Grandma," before returning to her Spotify playlist. I walked the blocks back to the bus stop like a ghost. The cold air didn't touch me. I couldn't feel the weight of my coat, couldn't hear the sound of my own shoes. I sat on the bench and looked at nothing. Not the traffic, not the people, not the signs advertising flu shots and fast burritos. I saw the quilt, not the fabric, but the meaning of it. What it had meant to me, what it hadn't meant to her. It wasn't the object. People confuse that. They think when we cry over a thing, it's the thing itself. It's not. It's what we poured into it. That quilt held decades. It held my mother's apron, the trim from my daughter's crib sheet, the corner of a scarf I wore the day I found out I was pregnant with Claire's mother. I had spent weeks choosing the right patterns, the right placement, not just for beauty, but for memory. I wanted Claire to feel the weight of her lineage. I wanted her to see that she came from women who sewed, who built, who repaired, who made warmth from scraps. And now she had used that same warmth to pad a casserole dish. On the ride home, I pressed my fingers against my lap to stop them from trembling. People would say it was no big deal. People would say she was young, that she didn't know, that it wasn't intentional. But neglect doesn't have to be intentional to hurt. In fact, that's what makes it worse. She didn't even see me in the quilt. She saw a thing, an old thing, a soft thing. And I realized, in that exact moment, that this wasn't an isolated offense. It was a culmination. The 1,000 small indignities, the polite forgettings, the birthdays acknowledged with a text and a photo of balloons I never got to see in person, the family recipes altered without my name, the stories I started telling that were brushed aside for phone notifications and streaming schedules. This was not the first time I had been tucked into a corner. It was just the first time I had found myself there so literally. That night, I didn't turn on the light when I entered my apartment. I sat in the dark and listened to the silence of my own home. It was a kind silence. No music I didn't choose. No laughing at jokes I didn't understand. No layers of lives I wasn't invited to be part of. Just quiet. Honest quiet. I thought about my own grandmother then. A woman who lived in a house that always smelled of starch and onions, who sewed her own sheets and refused to speak unless she had something of value to say. She died with her hands in her lap, palms up, as if waiting for something that never came. I used to think she was cold. Now I think she was tired. Tired of giving softness to people who only wanted cushions. That quilt was not ruined. It wasn't torn or burned or lost. No, it was worse. It was used. Used in a way that stripped it of its spirit. Used like a thing with no name, no memory, no cost. And that's what made it the turning point. That's what turned me. Because for the first time in my life, I understood that love offered without understanding is not noble, it's wasteful. I had given them everything without teaching them what it cost me. And now they lived in a world where quilts are just packing foam and grandmothers are just delivery women for bunt pans. That day, on the bus, I realized I couldn't change Claire. I couldn't make her see me, but I could choose to stop placing my stories in her hands. I could choose silence, not as retreat, but as boundary. I could stop making things for people who confuse legacy with laundry. I could stitch for myself, or not at all. And that, strangely, felt like the beginning of something. Not anger, not grief, but something cleaner. The thin, sharp edge of clarity. After that day, something shifted. Not like a crack or a shatter, but more like the slow slipping of a picture frame on a wall, a quiet slant you don't notice at first, until one morning it crashes to the floor and you realize it had been off balance, all along. Nothing dramatic happened in the days that followed. No argument, no apology, no grand gestures of reconciliation, just absence. Claire didn't call, not that she had called much before, but even that polite rhythm, the holiday check-ins, the forwarded memes with emojis, the obligatory birthday texts, faded into nothing. I waited for a week, telling myself she was busy, planning her life, making a home. I stared at my phone, at the blank notification screen, and then I put it in the drawer because I was tired of watching nothing happen. I didn't call her either. For the first time, I didn't reach out. And in the space that opened between us, I began to feel the shape of what I had allowed. It was not the silence that hurt me most. It was realizing how natural it felt to everyone else. At church, I sat in my usual pew, the same third row from the back, where the light from the high windows falls in slanted lines across the wood. Mrs. Davenport, who always wore lavender, asked about Claire's wedding. I smiled and said it was beautiful. She asked if they'd liked the quilt. I hesitated and then lied. I said, "Oh yes, they loved it." It meant a lot, because that's what you do when the truth is too sharp to say out loud in the lobby next to the coat rack. I walked home slowly that morning, stopping at the corner bakery I used to go to with Claire when she was little. Back then, she'd always order the lemon tart because it looked like the sun. I stood in line and realized I didn't know what her favorite dessert was anymore, or if she even ate sweets at all. She had become one of those people who count steps and post about kombucha. I bought a scone for myself and ate it on a bench, crumbs falling into my lap like the quiet dust of lost time. At home, I opened my sewing drawer and found the leftover scraps from the quilt. I thought about throwing them away. My hand hovered over the wastebasket, but something in me flinched. I folded them instead, carefully, the way one folds love that has nowhere left to land. I placed them in a box and labelled it "Someday," though I already knew I might never open it again. The fabric still smelled faintly of lavender and iron, of afternoons spent tracing seams and whispering to myself to keep the needle steady. I thought of all the things I'd made over the years. Dresses for my daughter, costumes for school plays, the table runners no one uses anymore because everyone has granite countertops and minimalism now. Once, they would call me so creative, but now people just say, "Oh, you still do that?" As if stitching had become a quaint relic, like churning butter or rotary phones. I used to be a mother, with hands always busy. Now I was an old woman with nothing pressing to mend. I began to notice the other ways I had been reduced, quietly, subtly, politely. I'd always been the one who brought deviled eggs to family events. Now they were store-bought, arranged on plastic trays with decorative parsley. No one asked for my recipe. At Christmas, I offered to make my traditional glazed ham. Claire's mother said, "Maybe let the younger ones do it this year. You deserve to relax." But relaxing just meant watching my own traditions replaced by Pinterest versions made in kitchens where I was no longer welcome. I sat at the table and complimented dishes that had no soul, no memory, no stains in their history. Everyone smiled. The lights were soft, the music curated, the photos staged. I smiled too, though I felt like a ghost, like a portrait hanging on a wall no one looks at unless they need to fill a silence. I stopped offering. That was my first quiet rebellion. I stopped asking what they needed, stopped sending boxes of cookies that arrived late and were probably thrown out. I stopped knitting scarves for children who already had 6 from Target. I began to take long walks instead, to sit by the duck pond and watch the seasons change. Ducks don't care who made their bread. They just eat it. They don't pretend gratitude. It felt honest. One afternoon, I walked past the community centre bulletin board and saw a sign. Quilting Circle, Wednesdays at 3. Beginners welcome. I stared at it for a long time. I wasn't a beginner, not by any stretch. But something about the invitation felt warm. I showed up the next week, half expecting it to be a room of beige sweaters and bad lighting. It was, but it was also something else. Laughter, messiness, people dropping pins and confessing things between stitches. One woman, Rata, said, "My daughter sold my grandmother's china at a garage sale. Said I was too sentimental." She was right. I cried over a sugar bowl. Another woman nodded and said, "I cried when mine donated my wedding dress to a costume shop. They called it vintage." I didn't speak at first. I just listened. And in that listening, I heard myself echoed back in the voices of other women who had been folded into silence, who had loved too hard, who had been dismissed with a smile. I started bringing my own scraps, not the family ones, but new ones. Bright patterns, nothing symbolic, just colour. The others noticed. "You've got an eye," someone said. I smiled and said, "It's old, but still works." They laughed. It was the kind of laugh that doesn't cut you, the kind that says, "Stay." So I stayed, every Wednesday, and I stitched. Not legacy, not memory, just shape and shade and texture, just joy. At night, I lay under a blanket I didn't make and realized that something in me had grown quiet in a different way. Not the silence of being ignored, but the silence of no longer trying. I didn't need to be heard by people who only tuned in when it was convenient. I didn't need to be thanked by a granddaughter who saw handmade things as clutter. I needed to stop needing that. And slowly, I was. Claire posted pictures of her Friendsgiving online. I saw the dishes wrapped in newspaper. The quilt was not in the photos. I wondered if she even remembered using it. Or if it had already been thrown out or packed away with the winter coats. I didn't ask. I didn't comment. I didn't click like. I just kept scrolling. That, too, was a kind of choice, not bitterness, just distance. I was becoming a woman who observed, not participated. And I found, strangely, a kind of peace in that. Not the peace I once wanted, the warm, candle-lit kind, surrounded by family who saw me, but the kind of peace you get when you finally put down the basket and say, "No more," not out of anger, just because your hands are tired and the road ahead is yours now. And that realization, that no one would stop me if I walked away, that maybe no one would even notice, is what shook me. Not because it was cruel, but because it was true. It started with colour, not memory, not duty, just colour. A soft orange cotton with tiny blue vines, the kind of pattern no one would wear anymore, but that made me smile when I unfolded it. I'd picked it up at a thrift store during one of my walks. A spontaneous decision. The fabric folded carelessly under a stack of mismatched linens. It wasn't part of anyone's childhood, wasn't pulled from a box of forgotten clothes. It had no story, and that's why I liked it. I brought it home, pressed it gently, and started to cut. No plan, no purpose, no future recipient. I just let the pieces fall into shape. For the first time in years, I sewed for no one, and it felt like breathing after a long time underwater. At the community centre, Rita noticed. "You've got some bite in your colour this week," she said, nodding toward my pile. I smiled and said nothing, because the truth felt too private to name. I wasn't sewing nostalgia. I was sewing defiance. Each square, each stitch, was mine and mine alone. They didn't carry Claire's birth date or my daughter's favourite shade. They weren't stitched with the hope of being passed down. They were stitched to stay with me. I stopped using old family fabrics. I bought what I liked, even if it was cheap, even if it was loud. I started to experiment. Diagonals, applique, even the kind of chaotic patterns I used to wrinkle my nose at. The other women raised eyebrows, then leaned closer. "That's bold," someone said. "It's not supposed to match," I replied. "It's supposed to feel." One of the volunteers at the centre, a young woman named Tessa, with hair the colour of copper wire and a dozen small tattoos on her arms, started sitting beside me. At first she just watched, asked about the basics, how to thread the needle, how to press seams. I taught her. Not because she reminded me of anyone, but because she didn't. She wasn't trying to replicate a lost past. She just wanted to make something with her hands. She didn't ask me about my family. She didn't bring up grandkids or husbands. She just said, "You're fast," one day, watching me piece a corner. "I've had practice," I replied, "decades of it." And she said, "Yeah, but it still looks like you enjoy it." That surprised me. I hadn't thought about joy in a long time. Not in that space, not with my hands. But she was right. Something about those unruly shapes, those wild colors, the way the thread pulled the fabric tight into a thing that made sense. It was pleasure. Pure and unanchored. I brought one of the new pieces home and pinned it to the wall. Just a square, nothing finished. But I liked seeing it when I woke up. It made the apartment feel less like a waiting room and more like a room that had a person in it. One afternoon, I caught myself humming while I sorted buttons. It wasn't a song I knew. It didn't belong to a memory. It was just a sound I made because my body felt light. I don't know when I stopped humming, but I know when I started again. It wasn't that I didn't think of Claire anymore. I did. I thought about the wedding, the smile that didn't reach her eyes when she thanked me for the gift. I thought about her apartment, the cold light of the kitchen, the impersonal way she referred to things. The quilt. Not your quilt, not the one you made. But I no longer thought of those things with sharpness. The sting had dulled. It had lost its place at the center of my heart. There were other things now. My walks to the fabric shop, the little dog that barked at the mailbox every morning, the way Tessa beamed when her seams finally aligned. I began to mark my days not by what I waited for, but by what I had done. I made soup. I finished a corner. I watched the wind move through the pine outside my window and didn't think about who might or might not call. My daughter texted once, just a picture of Claire on vacation. Sunglasses, a drink with a flower in it, the ocean in the background. No message, just the image. I stared at it for a long time and then closed it. I didn't reply. Not out of anger, just because there was nothing to say. What could I write? She looks tan. Glad she can travel? It wasn't bitterness. It was distance. The same distance she placed between us that day with the box of dishes and the careless laugh. I began a new quilt. This one was different. Big. No symmetry. No color scheme. Just shape and feeling. I didn't name it. I didn't plan who it was for. I just worked on it in pieces. Like a woman sweeping up the floor after a storm. One afternoon, Rita stopped by my table and watched me work. "What's it going to be?" she asked. "A statement?" I looked up at her, smiled softly and said, "No." "A boundary." She didn't ask what I meant. She just nodded, like someone who'd once built a fence of her own. I slept better. Not always, but often. The kind of sleep that comes from knowing you don't owe the next day to anyone but yourself. I drank tea in the morning and didn't check my phone. I walked without a destination. I began to write again. Just small notes, tiny sentences in a notebook. Observations, mostly. About birds. About color. About the way fabric changes when it warms in your lap. I felt not younger, but more solid. Not as though I had undone anything, but as though I had stepped out of a room I didn't belong in. One day, Tessa asked if I'd ever shown my quilts. At fairs or anything? I shook my head. "They were always gifts," I said. She looked at me, serious. "Well, maybe it's time you kept one." I looked down at the mess of color in front of me, the wild stitching, the loose threads. It didn't look like any of the gifts I used to make. It looked like a map of something unfinished. And for the first time, I thought, maybe that's what I am too. Not a legacy, not a matriarch, not a vessel, just a woman, still sewing, still figuring out how to stay whole. It was a Thursday when the letter came. Not a holiday, not an anniversary, just a regular day with laundry tumbling in the machine and soup cooling on the counter. I wasn't expecting anything. Most of the mail that finds its way to my little box these days is either advertisements or mistakes, coupons for things I don't need, catalogues from places I haven't shopped at in years, reminders of how easy it is to disappear from the lists that used to include you. But this envelope had my name written by hand, in a script I hadn't seen in a long time. Round, rushed, slightly slanted. My heart knew it before my mind could name it. Kieran, my oldest grandchild, Claire's younger cousin. The only one who used to sneak into my kitchen and ask about the stories behind my freckles. I hadn't heard from him since the wedding, hadn't expected to. I sat down before I opened it, my hands suddenly unsteady in a way that had nothing to do with age. The letter was short, just a few lines. No flourish. Grandma, where are you? Dad says you've been quiet. Claire's not saying anything, but she seems off. I miss you. I keep checking my phone. Please let me know you're okay. He'd included a phone number I didn't recognize, probably his new one. I read the note 3 times, folded it carefully, then tucked it inside my recipe box like it was something sacred. I didn't call. I wasn't ready. But something in me stirred. The memory of his small hand wrapped around mine, the way he used to beg me to let him stay 10 more minutes after dinner. I thought of the way he'd laughed when he saw the quilt I was working on for Claire, said it looked like a treasure map. And now here he was, years later, asking if I was lost. I didn't respond. But I started carrying his letter with me, tucked into the inside pocket of my coat. It was a reminder that not every thread had unraveled, that some part of me still lived in someone else's memory, not as a function, not as a background figure, but as a person. I didn't tell anyone about the letter. Not even the women at the quilting circle, though I caught myself smiling more than usual that week. The needle moved with more steadiness, and when Tessa said, "You look lighter," I said, "I think I am." But lightness has a way of provoking the dark. Just as I was rediscovering breath, the past came knocking in a new disguise. It started with a voicemail. One I didn't expect, one I didn't ask for. I had left my phone on by accident after checking the weather, and when I glanced at it that evening, there was a red bubble on the screen. One new message. I tapped it without thinking, and there it was. Lisa's voice, my daughter. Flat, too cheerful, clipped in that way people use when they're trying to sound calm but are holding back irritation. "Hi, Mom. Just checking in? Claire mentioned you stopped by a few weeks ago, and I realized I haven't heard from you. Hope everything's okay. Call me?" It ended with that upward lilt, that artificial softness that made the question feel less like concern and more like surveillance. I stared at the screen, then hit delete. I didn't want to hear her pretend not to know what was wrong. I didn't want to hear her avoid the word quilt like it was a bad tooth she was scared to touch. But the messages didn't stop. Over the next few days, they came more frequently. First one from Claire, saying she'd loved seeing me, that she hoped I wasn't upset about anything. And then another from Lisa again, this time a little less controlled. "We're starting to worry. Could you just let us know you're all right?" I didn't reply. I didn't want to reward their sudden interest, because it wasn't about me. It was about guilt. It was about image, about the sudden realization that I had slipped out of view, and maybe, just maybe, that I wouldn't come back on their terms. And then came the envelope, larger this time. Manila, stamped. Return address from a law office I didn't recognize. Inside, a formal letter, full of soft threats, dressed as kindness. We've been made aware of your recent withdrawal from family contact. Your children are concerned for your well-being and wish to ensure that you are not under duress or in any form of decline. If you require assistance in managing your affairs, our office is prepared to help coordinate appropriate support. My blood went cold. Support, that word. Like I was a structure about to collapse. Like I was a burden, a mess, a risk. I read the letter twice, then folded it back into its envelope and placed it under a stack of old tax receipts. I didn't want it in plain view. I didn't want it near the table where I worked. It felt like an intrusion, like someone had opened a door without knocking. I told myself it would pass, that they would tire of their concern once it failed to give them the response they wanted. But then someone left a message at the community center. The front desk attendant handed it to me one afternoon with a hesitant smile. A man called, said he was your son. Asked if you were attending any events here. I thanked her and took the note, my hands tight. Adam. Of course it was Adam. The man who used to call me Mom in that sweet, distracted way, who once asked for money for a down payment and never said thank you. The same man who, according to Claire, hadn't thought twice when the quilt disappeared into a box. He wanted to find me now, not because he missed me, because he was afraid of what I might say, or not say, of what I might do with the pieces of my life they hadn't claimed. I walked home slowly that day. The streets felt different, less like freedom and more like exposure. I hated that. I hated that they had found a way to poison my quiet, that they had pierced the bubble I had made not with shouting, but with concern. The most manipulative weapon of all. Because when someone says they're worried, how do you fight that? How do you say, "Leave me alone," without sounding cruel? I boiled water for tea, but I didn't drink it. I sat at the window, watching the dusk settle into the trees, and I thought about disappearing again. Not literally, but emotionally. I thought about cancelling the community centre, changing my number, moving to another building. But I was tired of running, tired of reacting. I had already made the hardest decision, to stop giving them access to my love. What I needed now was to protect that decision. The next morning, I sat at my sewing table and drafted a letter, not to them, but to myself. A list of reminders. You are not a ghost. You are not a failure. You are not required to explain your absence to people who created the need for it. I taped it to the inside of my closet door. I read it every morning for a week, and then the phone rang again. Not Adam, not Lisa. It was Kieran. I didn't answer the first time, or the second. But on the third ring, something in me softened. I pressed the green button and lifted the phone. His voice was quiet, unsure. "Grandma?" I closed my eyes. "I'm here," I said. He let out a breath I didn't know he was holding. "You're okay?" "I'm better than okay," I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "They're freaking out." I smiled. "I know. Claire's being weird. Dad's angry. But I don't know. I wanted to hear your voice." I didn't cry, but something in me settled, like a stone in a stream finally finding its resting place. "Thank you for calling," I said. "You're the only one who didn't come looking to correct me." "I didn't want to correct you," he said. "I just wanted to find you." We didn't talk long, but it was enough. enough to remind me that one person, one thread, can hold the whole cloth steady. The next day, I mailed him a small package. Inside, I placed a square of the orange and blue fabric, the one he'd once called a treasure map. I included a note. Not everything I make is for everyone, but this one, maybe, was meant for you. It happened one morning, not out of anger or impulsiveness, but out of a kind of calm I hadn't felt in years. I had been sitting at my sewing table, working on a final row for the quilt I'd begun after the silence settled in. The fabric pieces were unlike anything I'd used before. Bright, chaotic, defiantly cheerful, stitched with a kind of quiet resolve. I looked at what I'd made, the sprawling asymmetry of it, and realized I had come to the end of something. Not the quilt, though yes, that too, but of a long chapter of unspoken hunger, of giving and waiting, of offering and hoping. I smoothed my hand over the cloth and whispered, not dramatically, but truthfully, "This one is for me." The words didn't feel strange. They felt overdue. I folded the quilt carefully and placed it in the cedar chest at the foot of my bed. It was the first one I hadn't given away. Then I reached for the file folder I'd been slowly updating for months. It held my will, my medical directives, and a series of letters I'd written in fits and starts, one to each of my children and grandchildren. They weren't bitter. I'd made sure of that. They weren't even sad. They were just clear. I wrote of the things I had loved, the things I had made, the stories behind objects that might one day sit silently in their homes. I told them where the recipes came from, why the tablecloth with the small hole was the one I never threw away. I wrote about the old ashtray in the shape of a swan that nobody liked. It had been a wedding gift from my mother, who'd died before my children were old enough to remember her. I wrote about Claire's quilt, too. I described every patch, every origin, every intention, not to guilt her, not to reopen the wound, but to record what had been, to mark that it mattered, even if only to me, especially to me. And then I did something I had been thinking about for weeks, but had never fully imagined I would do. I got dressed, carefully, with intention. I wore the blouse my husband had loved, the one with the small lavender buttons. I brushed my hair, pinned it up, applied a touch of lipstick. Not for vanity, for ceremony. I packed a small bag and took a cab to the lawyer's office, the same one that had sent the letter at Lisa's request. I had called ahead, made an appointment, not to confront anyone, but to make adjustments. I sat across from a young man in a crisp shirt and told him what I wanted: to revise my beneficiaries, to create a bequest to the community centre quilting group, enough to buy materials for women who couldn't afford them, to donate my sewing machine and remaining fabrics to the programme after my death, to name Kieran, and only Kieran, as the recipient of my cedar chest and its contents, not because he had earned it, but because he had shown up without demand. The lawyer asked gently, "Would you like to notify the others of these changes?" I smiled and said, "They'll find out when the time is right. They've been finding out things late for years. It won't be new." He looked uncomfortable, but he nodded. I signed the papers with a hand that didn't shake. When it was done, I stood up and thanked him. As I stepped into the afternoon light, I felt something unfasten inside me. Not sadness, not even relief, but a kind of spaciousness, like I had cleared a room that had been overfull for too long. I walked home, instead of calling another cab. The sky was overcast, but I felt tall. Not young, not triumphant, just tall in the way a woman stands when she is no longer leaning forward in apology. That evening I made tea and opened a fresh notebook. I wrote a new recipe for ginger cookies, one I had adjusted to suit my own tastes. less sugar, more bite. I didn't intend to share it. I just wanted to remember it. I sat in my chair by the window, wrapped not in a memory, but in the new quilt, my quilt, and watched the light fade. The world didn't change. No one called. No one knew what I had done. But I knew. I had stitched something into permanence. Not fabric, not story, but boundary. The kind that isn't drawn in anger, but in wisdom. The kind that says, "This is where I stop giving myself to people who confuse generosity with weakness." That night, I slept with the windows open, and I dreamed not of the past, but of patterns I hadn't sewn yet. Wild ones, full of colours that didn't match, shapes that didn't obey. And I thought, maybe that's who I am now. Not a legacy, not a keepsake, just a woman who makes things and finally keeps them. It's quiet now. Not the kind of quiet that presses on your chest. Not the kind that comes with waiting for a knock or a ring or a line of text that never arrives. This quiet is different. It's chosen. It's the quiet of a room you have cleaned yourself, of a house closed up for the night, of a garden trimmed back for winter. It is the quiet of enough. I wake each morning without checking my phone. I do not scan for messages from people who once made me small. I make tea. I choose my cup not for its sentiment, but for its size. I sit by the window in a robe that's older than most of my children's marriages, and I let the sun, if it chooses to show up, rest on my knees. Some days I sew. Some days I walk. Some days I do nothing. And none of it feels wasted. I haven't heard from Lisa in weeks. Adam sent an email once, something brief and performative, asking if I needed groceries or had fallen. I didn't respond. Claire sent a picture of a blanket she bought on vacation. I deleted it without opening. Not out of cruelty, but because I don't want to pretend anymore. I don't want to pretend that I can be spoken to like a side table, useful when needed, invisible otherwise. They will say, in time, that I grew distant, that I changed, that I became harder. They will tell each other stories that protect their own versions of me, that I was always generous, that I always forgave. And in that retelling, they will never speak of the quilt. They will never say what they did. And that's fine, because I no longer need their recognition to validate what I survived. There is a kind of strength that comes not from confrontation, but from refusal. I refused to explain myself. I refused to audition for their approval. I refused to hand over the last scraps of tenderness in the name of being good. I was good. I was good until it hurt. I gave until the giving erased me, and now I make things again. Not for legacy, not for memory, but for the sheer fact that my hands still know how. I keep my own work now. I live among things I created that don't belong to anyone else. I've learned how to be my own heirloom. Sometimes, when I sit with the women at the community centre, I think of all the grandmothers who came before us. Women whose names were sewn into doilies and forgotten. Women whose pies were remembered, but whose pain never was. I think of how many of us died with stories tucked under our tongues because no one asked. I think of my own grandmother, hands folded, waiting. And I realize I don't want to wait anymore. I don't want to be a question mark in someone else's life. I want to be a period, a full stop, a woman who ended her own sentence. So if someone one day finds this room, this quilt, this quiet stack of notebooks and loose threads, I hope they understand. Not everything I made was meant to last, but everything I made was meant to mean something. And when I stopped giving it to people who couldn't hold it, I started giving it to myself. That was the beginning of peace. And if you are like me, if you're sitting alone, wondering if your worth has an expiration date, hear this. You are not fabric. You are not a vessel. You are not a phase in someone else's timeline. You are still here, and that is enough.